Family isn't just about blood, it's about loyalty. And for Lorenzo Moretti, the ruthless capo of the New York underworld, loyalty was the only currency that mattered. He thought he knew everyone in his city, until a quiet waitress at a dusty diner did the impossible. She didn't flinch at his gun. She didn't tremble at his name. Instead, she spoke a few soft words in a dialect that hadn't been heard outside of Sicily in 30 years. In that moment, she didn't just serve a table. She unlocked a war that would burn the city to the ground. Watch until the end to see who she really is. The rain in Brooklyn didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. It was a Tuesday night in late November, the kind of night that soaked into your bones and refused to leave. Inside Sal's trattoria, however, the air was warm, thick with the scent of roasted garlic, simmering San Marzano tomatoes, and the sharp tang of balsamic vinegar. It wasn't the finest establishment in the borough. The checkered tablecloths were fading, and the neon sign outside buzzed with an irritating flicker. But for Lorenzo Moretti, it was the only neutral ground left in a city that was rapidly becoming a chessboard of violence. Lorenzo sat in the back booth, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the entrance every 3 seconds. At 32, he wore the weight of the Moretti crime family like a tailored suit, impeccable, expensive, and restrictive. He adjusted the cuff of his Brioni jacket, glancing at the woman sitting opposite him. "Mangia, Mama," Lorenzo said softly, his voice a low rumble that usually commanded silence in boardrooms and warehouses alike. "The osso buco is good tonight." Donatella Moretti, the matriarch of the family, pushed her plate away with a trembling hand. Dementia was a cruel thief. It had stolen her memories of her late husband, the legendary Don Antonio, and sometimes it stole her recognition of her own son. But tonight she was lucid, though agitated. "It's not right, Enzo," she whispered, her eyes darting around the empty restaurant. "The air, it smells like sulfur, like betrayal." "It's just the rain, Mama," Lorenzo assured her, though his hand drifted instinctively toward the concealed holster beneath his jacket. He signaled for the waitress. The girl who approached wasn't the usual server, a stout man named Giovanni who had been skimming off the register for years. This was someone new. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a severe, messy bun that failed to hide the stray curls framing a face that was striking, if exhausted. Her name tag read Elena, but it hung crookedly on her uniform. "More wine?" she asked. Her voice was flat, American, tired. She didn't look at Lorenzo. She looked at the table, focused on the empty breadbasket. "Please," Lorenzo said, his eyes narrowing. He didn't like new faces. New faces meant new variables. "And bring my mother some sparkling water, with lemon." "No lemon," Donatella snapped suddenly, her voice cracking. She looked up at the waitress, her eyes filling with confused tears. "I want the water from the well, the one by the orange grove. Do you know it, where the sun hits the stone?" Lorenzo sighed, reaching out to cover his mother's hand. "Mama, we're in Brooklyn. There is no orange grove." Donatella began to weep, a soft, heartbreaking sound that made Lorenzo's chest tighten. He hated seeing her like this, lost in a past that didn't exist anymore. He opened his mouth to apologize to the waitress and dismiss her, but the waitress didn't leave. Instead, Elena froze. She looked down at the old woman, her expression shifting from exhaustion to something softer. A flicker of recognition? Or perhaps just pity. Then she spoke. "Non piangere, signora. L'acqua è dolce anche qui, se la bevi con il cuore sereno." "Don't cry, madam. The water is sweet here, too, if you drink it with a serene heart." Lorenzo's blood went cold. It wasn't just that she spoke Italian. Half of Brooklyn spoke Italian. It was the dialect. It was the specific, rolling cadence of the Sicilian Highlands, a village dialect from Corleone that had effectively died out 2 generations ago. It was the language his grandmother used to speak. It was the language of the old country, before the wars, before the drugs, before the Morettis became kings of New York. Donatella stopped crying instantly. She looked up, her eyes wide and clear. You know the words?" Elena smiled, a a sad, fleeting thing that transformed her face from plain to breathtaking. "Sigh, my nonna taught me, before the fire." "The fire?" Lorenzo interjected, his voice sharp. He wasn't looking at his mother anymore. He was studying Elena with the intensity of a predator spotting prey that didn't belong in its territory. "Which fire?" Elena's eyes snapped to his, and for the first time she really looked at him. Most people flinched when they met Lorenzo Moretti's gaze. His eyes were the color of cold espresso, dark and unforgiving. But Elena didn't flinch. She held his gaze with a defiance that was almost reckless. "Just a story, sir," she said, reverting to English. The flatness returned to her voice, the mask slipping back into place. "I'll get the water. No lemon." She turned on her heel and walked away, her movements efficient, but Lorenzo noticed the way her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the tray. "She's one of us, Enzo," Donatello whispered, clutching his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "She smells like the old country. She smells like rosemary and ash." "She's a waitress, Mama," Lorenzo said dismissively, but his mind was racing. He pulled out his phone, a custom-encrypted BlackBerry that cost more than the waitress made in a year. He typed a quick message to his consigliere. "Marco, Sal's Trattoria. Waitress named Elena. New hire. I want a full dossier. Now." Lorenzo watched her across the room as she poured wine for a couple in the corner. She moved with a grace that the cheap uniform couldn't hide. She was too alert, too observant. She checked the exits every time the door chime rang. "Excuse me," Lorenzo called out as she passed their table again. She stopped, clutching the water pitcher. "Yes, sir?" "You speak the dialect of Corleone," Lorenzo stated, not asking. "My family is from there. I haven't heard that accent since my grandfather passed." "It's a small world," Elena said, her jaw tight. "Here is the water." "What is your last name, Elena?" "Rossi." She lied. It was the most common Italian surname. It was a lazy lie. Lorenzo stood up. He was a tall man, 6'3" of muscle and tailored wool. He loomed over her, invading her personal space just enough to be intimidating. "You're lying. Rosses don't speak the high mountain dialect. Who are you?" Before Elena could answer, the front door of the trattoria crashed open. The bell didn't chime. It shattered as the glass pane was kicked in. 3 men stormed in, wearing balaclavas and tactical vests, wielding sawed-off shotguns. The few patrons screamed and dove under tables. "Moretti!" the lead gunman screamed, his voice muffled by the mask. "Death to the king!" Lorenzo's instincts, honed by a decade of gang warfare, kicked in instantly. He didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. His first priority was Donatella. He shoved the table aside, grabbing his mother and throwing her to the floor behind the heavy oak booth. "Get down!" he roared. Bullets shredded the air. Wood splintered. Glass exploded, and the smell of cordite filled the room. Lorenzo drew his custom Beretta 9.2 FS from his shoulder holster, popping up to fire 2 controlled shots. One attacker went down, clutching his shoulder. But there were 2 more, and they were advancing, their shotguns leveling at the booth where Lorenzo and his mother were pinned. He was outgunned. He needed an angle. Suddenly, a blur of motion erupted from behind the counter. It was Elena. She didn't scream. She didn't hide. She vaulted over the bar top with the agility of a gymnast. In her hand, she didn't hold a tray or a pitcher. She held a sleek, silver throwing knife. A steak knife she must have grabbed from a table setup. With a flick of her wrist that was almost too fast to track, the knife sailed through the air. It buried itself deep into the forearm of the second gunman just as he was about to pull the trigger. He screamed, dropping the shotgun. Elena didn't stop. She closed the distance on the third man before he could pivot. She wasn't fighting like a brawler. She was fighting like a soldier. She kicked the back of his knee, forcing him down, then drove her elbow into his temple with a sickening crack. He collapsed, unconscious. Silence fell over the restaurant, broken only by the sobbing of the other patrons and the groans of the wounded gunman. Lorenzo stood up slowly, his gun still raised. He looked at the carnage. He looked at his shaking mother on the floor. And then he looked at the waitress. Elena stood over the unconscious man, her chest heaving, her hair coming loose from the bun. She looked at her own hands as if surprised by what they had just done. Then she looked at Lorenzo. The fear in her eyes was real now. But it wasn't fear of the gunman. It was fear of him. "Who the hell are you?" Lorenzo demanded, stepping over the broken glass, his gun pointed at the floor, but his intensity aimed squarely at her. Elena stammered, backing away until she hit the bar. "I just self-defense class at the YMCA." "Don't insult my intelligence," Lorenzo growled. "That was Krav Maga mixed with Sicilian knife fighting. You took down 3 hitmen from the Ivanov syndicate in 10 seconds. He cornered her against the bar. The smell of rain and expensive cologne overwhelmed her. He reached out, grabbing her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You speak my mother's dead language. You fight like a ghost. And you lied about your name." Lorenzo's thumb brushed against her jawline, a touch that was dangerously possessive. "You saved my life, Elena, which means you are now my responsibility. Or my prisoner. I haven't decided which." "I don't need your protection," she hissed, pulling away, "and I definitely don't want to be your prisoner. Let me go." "Go where?" Lorenzo gestured to the siren lights, flashing blue and red against the wet windows outside. The NYPD was arriving. "You just assaulted 3 men in a mob hit. You think the cops will give you a medal? You think the Ivanovs will forget your face?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "You entered my world the moment you spoke to my mother, Cara Mia. There is no exit door. Get in the car." "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "My shift isn't over." Lorenzo stared at her, then let out a dark, incredulous laugh. "Your shift is over, Elena. Your life as a waitress is over." He grabbed her hand, the same hand that had thrown the knife, and pulled her toward the back exit, dragging her into the darkness of the Brooklyn alleyway, just as the police kicked down the front door. Donatella, shuffling behind them with the confused agility of the elderly, muttered to herself in Italian, "The wolf has found the lamb. But who has the sharper teeth?" The ride to the Moretti estate in Long Island was silent. Lorenzo drove the black-armored Mercedes G-Wagon himself, his knuckles white on the leather steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, he saw his mother asleep in the back, sedated by the shock of the evening. Beside him, Elena sat rigid, staring out the window as the city lights blurred into the dark canopy of the suburbs. "You're bleeding," Lorenzo said, breaking the silence. Elena looked down. There was a shallow gash on her arm from the shattered glass. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. It's my blood debt." "I didn't do it for you," Elena said coldly. "They were going to shoot the old woman. I don't let innocent people die." "You think I'm not innocent?" Lorenzo asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. "I know who you are, Lorenzo Moretti," she said, turning to face him. "I read the papers. You own the docks. You own the construction unions. You're not a businessman. You're a shark in a suit. And yet, you're sitting in the shark's car." "Better the shark than the police," she muttered. "I have reasons to avoid the authorities." Lorenzo glanced at her. This woman was a puzzle box wrapped in a cheap waitress uniform. "We'll discuss your reasons at the house. And you will tell me the truth. If you lie to me again, Elena, I won't be as polite." They pulled up to the gates of the Moretti estate, a sprawling mansion that looked more like a fortress. High stone walls, cameras every 10 feet, and guards patrolling the perimeter with assault rifles. As the gates opened, Elena felt a sense of claustrophobia set in. She had traded one hiding spot for a much more dangerous one. Inside, the house was a museum of marble and gold leaf. Lorenzo handed his mother off to the head housekeeper, a stern woman named Maria, and then turned his attention to Elena. "My office," he commanded. He led her into a room that smelled of mahogany and cigar smoke. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, rare scotch, older than she was. He slid one across the desk to her. "Drink. It helps with the adrenaline crash." Elena ignored the drink. "Can I go now? I saved your mother. We're even." "We are far from even." Lorenzo walked around the desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms. "My men searched your locker at the restaurant while we were driving. No wallet, no ID. Just a bus pass and a book of poetry by Dante." "Who are you hiding from, Elena? An abusive ex? A debt collector?" Something like that, she deflected. Marco, my associate, ran your fingerprints from the water glass you touched. Elena's face went pale. You can't do that. I can do anything I want. This is my city. Lorenzo picked up a piece of paper from his desk, a fax that had come through moments before they arrived. But here's the interesting part. No match. You're not in the system. Not in the criminal database, not in the DMV, not in the voter registry. You don't exist. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. A woman with elite combat skills who speaks a dead dialect and has no digital footprint. You're not a waitress. You're a spy. Or an assassin. Suddenly, he moved. He pinned her against the bookshelf, his hand wrapping around her throat, not to choke, but to hold. Who sent you? The Russians? The Triads? Tell me, and I might let you live. Elena's eyes flashed with anger. She didn't struggle. She knew he was stronger. Instead, she used the only weapon she had left, the truth, or a version of it. My name is Elena Vitale, she whispered, her voice steady despite his hand on her neck. Lorenzo froze. He pulled his hand back as if burned. Vitale? That's impossible. The Vitale family was wiped out in Sicily 20 years ago, in the Great Purge. Not all of us, she said, her eyes glistening. My father was Marco Vitale, your father's best friend, and your father's betrayer. Lorenzo stumbled back. The history of the Moretti and Vitale families was written in blood. They had been allies, ruling Sicily together, until a war over territory turned them into bitter enemies. The Vitales were slaughtered. Lorenzo had been told that no one survived. If you were a Vitale, Lorenzo said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, then you are my enemy by blood. You should have let those men kill me. Why didn't you? Because, Elena said, stepping forward, my father didn't betray yours. He was framed, and I came to New York to prove it. I didn't want to kill you, Lorenzo. I wanted to use you to find the real traitor. You're lying, Lorenzo snarled. Am I? Elena reached into her bra. Lorenzo flinched, reaching for his gun, and pulled out a worn, folded photograph. She tossed it onto the desk. It was a black and white photo of two men laughing in a vineyard, holding up wine glasses. One was Lorenzo's father, young and vibrant. The other was a man Lorenzo vaguely recognized from old stories, Marco Vitale. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Brothers in Blood, until the end. Lorenzo stared at the photo. The silence in the room was deafening. I've been hiding for 20 years, Elena said, her voice breaking. Running from the people who actually killed my family, the same people who just tried to kill you tonight. The Ivanovs didn't order that hit, Lorenzo. The Ivanovs are clumsy. Those men moved like military. Lorenzo looked up at her. The anger was still there, but it was warring with confusion, and something else. Intrigue. If you are telling the truth, Lorenzo said slowly, then we have a common enemy who has been playing us against each other for decades. And if I'm lying? Elena challenged. Lorenzo walked up to her again. The tension between them shifted. It wasn't just threat anymore. It was charged with a sudden, electric attraction. Two survivors of a war they didn't start, standing in the wreckage. If you're lying, Lorenzo murmured, his face inches from hers, then you are the most beautiful mistake I'm ever going to make. He didn't kiss her. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But the door burst open. It was Marco, his actual consigliere, looking pale. Boss, we have a problem. The car bomb wasn't the only message. They just torched the warehouse in Jersey, and they left a note. What did it say? Lorenzo demanded, not taking his eyes off Elena. Marco swallowed hard. It says, give us the Vitale girl, and the war stops. Keep her, and we burn the city. Lorenzo looked at Elena. She looked back, terror and defiance warring in her eyes. It seems, Lorenzo said, a dark smile playing on his lips, that you really have stolen my peace, Elena. And now, you're about to help me start a war. The sun rose over the Moretti estate, casting long, pale shadows across the manicured lawns. But inside the mansion, the atmosphere was suffocating. The house was in total lockdown. Steel shutters had descended over the windows, and the corridors were lined with men who looked more like private military contractors than mob enforcers. Lorenzo stood in the kitchen, watching the security feeds on a tablet while sipping an espresso that was too bitter. Even for him, he hadn't slept. The message from the night before burned in his mind. "Give us the Vitale girl." "She is a liability, Enzo," Marco said, pacing the marble floor. Marco had been Lorenzo's right hand since they were boys stealing hubcaps in Queens, but today, the tension between them was palpable. The commission is already asking questions. They hear rumors that a Vitale is alive. "If the other families find out we are harboring the daughter of the man who supposedly betrayed your father, we lose our seat at the table. We lose everything." "She saved my mother," Lorenzo said, his voice low and dangerous. "And she says her father was framed." "If the Vitales were framed, Marco, then who really started the war 20 years ago?" Marco stopped pacing. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes shifting away. "Old history, boss." "Buried history. Why dig up graves?" "Because the dead are trying to kill me," Lorenzo snapped. He left Marco in the kitchen and walked up the grand staircase to the east wing, where he had confined Elena. He told himself he was going there to interrogate her, to find holes in her story, but deep down, he knew it was something else. He needed to see if the fire in her eyes was still there. He found her not in her room, but in the small sunroom at the end of the hall, sitting with his mother, Donatella. Lorenzo paused in the doorway, struck by the scene. Donatella was usually agitated in the mornings, confused by the shifting shadows, but today, she was calm. She was knitting a scarf, a task she hadn't managed in years, while Elena sat beside her, sorting through a box of old, dusty photographs. "He was a handsome devil, your father," Donatella was saying, her voice lucid. She pointed to a picture of a man with a thick mustache. "Marco Vitale. He used to bring me cannoli from the city every Sunday. He loved my Antonio like a brother." "Then why did everyone say he betrayed him?" Elena asked softly. Donatella stopped knitting. Her eyes clouded over, the dementia momentarily reclaiming her. "The whispering man," she murmured. "The man with the snake tattoo on his wrist. He whispered poison into Antonio's ear. He changed the ledgers. He made the numbers lie." Lorenzo stepped into the room. "What man, Mama?" Both women jumped. Lena looked up, her guard instantly returning. She wore one of Lorenzo's oversized dress shirts that the housekeeper had given her, and the sight of her in his clothes did strange things to his chest. "The man with the snake," Donatella repeated, agitated now. "He came before the fire. He wanted the routes, the shipping routes to Jersey." Lorenzo looked at Elena. "Did your father have a snake tattoo?" "No," Elena said, standing up, "but I know who does." Lorenzo crossed the room in 2 strides, gripping her upper arms. "Who?" "When I was on the run," Elena said, her voice steady, "I tracked the money. My father kept a diary. He wrote about a third partner. A silent partner who managed the books for both families, a man named Vincente Russo." Lorenzo released her, stepping back as if struck. "Vincente? That's impossible." "Vincente is the head of the Russo family. He's our strongest ally. He's the godfather of my nephew. He's also the man who stands to gain the most if the Morettis and the Vitales kill each other," Elena countered. "Think about it, Lorenzo. Who took over the Jersey ports after the Great Purge? The Russos. Who supplies the Ivanonovs with their weapons? The Russos." Lorenzo rubbed his temples. The headache that had been brewing all morning intensified. Vincente Russo was a legend in New York. A philanthropist, a businessman, a man who dined with senators. To accuse him was suicide. "You need proof," Lorenzo said. "You can't just throw accusations at a king." "I have proof," Elena said, "or I know where it is." "My father hid a ledger. The red ledger. It proves the embezzlement. It proves he was framed." "Where is it?" "It's in a safety deposit box at the hidden vault of the Banco di Napoli branch in Little Italy, the old branch that closed in the 90s. The vault is still there, underground." Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "That building is now a nightclub owned by the Triads. You want me to break into a Triad nightclub?" blow a vault, and find a book that might not exist, all while the entire city is hunting you? Elena stepped closer to him. For a waitress, she had the presence of a queen. She reached out and straightened the collar of his shirt. The intimacy of the gesture stunned him. "I don't want you to do it alone, Lorenzo," she whispered. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not. You stay here where it's safe." "I am the only one with the key," she revealed, pulling a heavy, iron key from a chain around her neck. It had been hidden under her shirt the whole time. "And the box is booby-trapped. My father was an engineer. If you open it wrong, the acid vials inside break and destroy the papers. You need me." Lorenzo stared at her. He looked at the key lying against her skin. He looked at her lips, which were parted slightly in anticipation. "You represent chaos, Elena," he murmured. "My life was ordered, predictable. Then you walked in with a pitcher of water and a knife and turned it all upside down." "Maybe you needed a little chaos," she replied. "Maybe." He leaned in. The air between them crackled. He could smell the soap she had used. Sandalwood and vanilla. He wanted to kiss her so badly it was a physical ache. He tilted his head, his lips brushing against her ear. "If we survive this," he whispered, "I am going to keep you. Do you understand? I am a selfish man, Elena. Once I claim something, I never let it go." Elena shivered, but she didn't pull away. "First, we have to survive." Lorenzo pulled back, his mask of cold authority sliding back into place. "Get dressed, not the uniform. There are clothes in the closet. Black, tactical. We're going to a nightclub." As he walked out, he pulled out his phone and dialed Marco. "Get the car," Lorenzo ordered, "and bring the heavy artillery. We're going to verify a ghost story." But as he walked down the hall, Lorenzo couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't the triads or the Russos. The real danger was the woman in the guest room, and the way she made him feel like he was no longer the one in control. The club was called Purgatory, fittingly enough. It was located in the basement of an old bank building on Mulberry Street, a relic of the days when Little Italy was the center of the universe. Now, it was a thumping, neon-lit labyrinth of flesh and vice, run by the Ghost Dragon Triad. Lorenzo and Elena didn't wait in line. They didn't pay the cover. They entered through the kitchen loading dock, silencing the two guards with efficient, brutal precision. Lorenzo was impressed. Elena moved through the shadows like she was born in them. She wasn't just a waitress who took a self-defense class. She was a warrior trained by a fugitive. "The vault entrance is behind the wine cellar," Elena whispered, pressing herself against the cold brick wall as a busboy walked past. Lorenzo nodded, signaling Marco and two other enforcers to hold the perimeter. "We go in, we get the book, we get out. No shooting unless necessary. I don't want a war with the Chinese tonight." They slipped into the wine cellar. The bass from the club floor above vibrated through the ceiling, shaking the dust off the vintage bottles. Elena went to a specific rack of Barolo, counted 3 bottles from the left, and pulled a hidden lever. The entire rack swung open, revealing a rusted steel door. "The old bank vault," Lorenzo said, admiring the mechanism. "Your father was clever." "He was paranoid," Elena corrected. "There's a difference." She inserted the iron key into the lock. It turned with a heavy clunk. They pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of dead time. Rows of safety deposit boxes lined the walls. Elena went to box 404. "Here." She performed a complicated series of turns with the key, left twice, right once, push in, left again. A click echoed in the silence. She slid the box out. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a red, leather-bound ledger. "The red ledger!" Lorenzo breathed. He reached for it. "Wait," Elena said, her hand hovering over it. "Once you read this, there is no going back. If Vincente Russo really is the traitor, you will have to kill him. And that will start a civil war in the 5 families that will make the streets run red." "The streets are already red, Elena," Lorenzo said grimly. "They are red with my father's blood. Give it to me." She handed him the book. Lorenzo opened it. His eyes scanned the columns of numbers. the handwriting he recognized as Marco Vitale's. And there, on every page, were the transfers. Millions of dollars siphoned from the Moretti and Vitale accounts, sent to offshore shell companies. And the signature authorizing them? V.R. Vincente Russo. "Son of a bitch," Lorenzo hissed. "He played us all. He made my father kill his best friend so he could take the territory." "Well, well, well," a voice boomed from the doorway of the vault. "I was wondering how long it would take you to figure it out." Lorenzo spun around, shielding Elena with his body. Standing in the vault entrance was not a triad member, it was Vincente Russo himself. He was an older man, in his 60s, wearing a white tuxedo and holding a gold-plated cane, but the cane concealed a blade, and behind him stood 10 men armed with submachine guns. "Uncle Vincente," Lorenzo said, his voice eerily calm. "I should have known. You always did have a habit of showing up where the money was." "And you, Lorenzo," Vincente smiled, a shark-like grin showing capped teeth. "You always were too sentimental, just like your father. You should have killed the girl the moment you saw her. Now you'll die with her." "How did you know we were here?" Elena demanded, stepping out from behind Lorenzo. "My dear," Vincente laughed, "I own the triads. Who do you think pays their rent? I knew the girl was in town the moment she applied for a job at that diner. I've been watching her for weeks, waiting for her to lead me to the only piece of evidence that could hurt me. And you did it. You led me right to the ledger." Lorenzo assessed the situation. 10 men. Automatic weapons. He had a handgun, and Elena had her knives. Marco was outside, likely already neutralized. "You can't kill a capo without the commission's approval," Lorenzo said, stalling for time. "Who says I'm going to kill you?" Vincente shrugged. "The triads will kill you. A drug deal gone wrong. Very tragic. I will mourn you at the funeral. I will take over your territory too. Honor your memory." Vincente raised his hand. "Kill them." The gunmen raised their weapons. Lorenzo looked at Elena. There was no fear in her eyes, only a fierce determination. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. "A lighter?" "No, a flashbang grenade." "Close your eyes," she screamed. She pulled the pin and dropped it. Bang! A blinding white light filled the small vault, followed by a deafening concussive blast. The gunman in the doorway screamed, blinded and disoriented. "Move!" Lorenzo roared. He didn't need to tell her twice. They charged the doorway. Lorenzo fired blindly but accurately, his muscle memory taking over. 2 men went down. He tackled a third, using him as a human shield as he exited the vault into the wine cellar. Elena was a whirlwind. She slid across the floor, slicing the Achilles tendon of a gunman, then grabbing his falling weapon. She fired a burst into the ceiling, bringing down a heavy chandelier onto 2 more attackers. "The loading dock is blocked!" Marco's voice crackled over Lorenzo's earpiece. "We have to go up! Through the club!" "Upstairs!" Lorenzo grabbed Elena's hand. They burst out of the wine cellar and into the main club. The scene was chaotic. The music was still blasting. Heavy techno that masked the sound of gunshots. Hundreds of people were dancing, unaware that a Mafia war had just erupted in their midst. "Blend in!" Lorenzo shouted over the music. He holstered his gun and pulled Elena close, dragging her onto the crowded dance floor. The strobe lights flashed red, blue, white, disorienting their pursuers. Vincente's men were pushing through the crowd, looking for them. "They're blocking the exits," Elena said, her mouth close to his ear. She was breathless, her adrenaline high. "We need a distraction," Lorenzo said. He looked at the DJ booth on the balcony above them. "Can you shoot?" "I rarely miss." "Shoot the fire suppression system on the ceiling." Elena didn't hesitate. She drew the stolen pistol, aimed through the flashing lights, and fired a single shot. It hit the sprinkler valve perfectly. Instantly, dirty, cold water began to rain down on the club. The music short-circuited with a screech. The crowd screamed, panic setting in as people rushed for the doors, creating a stampede. "Now we move," Lorenzo said. Using the stampede as cover, they pushed through the crowd toward the VIP exit. Vincente's men were swept away by the tide of terrified clubgoers. They burst out into the alleyway, soaking wet, gasping for air. Marco pulled up in the G-Wagon, tires screeching, "Get in!" They dove into the back seat. The car sped off just as bullets sparked against the pavement behind them. Lorenzo fell back against the leather seat, his chest heaving. He looked at Elena. Her hair was plastered to her face, her tactical gear soaked, her eyes wild. She looked magnificent. She held up the red ledger. "I still have it." Lorenzo started to laugh. It was a release of tension, of madness. He grabbed her face and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was hard, desperate, a kiss of survival. She kissed him back with equal force, her hands tangling in his wet hair. When they broke apart, Lorenzo rested his forehead against hers. "You are trouble, Elena Vitale," he said. "And you are wet, Lorenzo Moretti," she replied, a smirk playing on her lips. Lorenzo turned to the front. "Marco, call the commission. Tell them I am calling an emergency meeting. Tonight." "Tonight?" Marco asked, eyeing them in the rearview mirror. "Boss, you look like a drowned rat." "I don't care how I look," Lorenzo said, his voice hardening into cold steel. "Vincente Russo wants a war. I'm going to give him one, but not in the streets. I'm going to kill in front of everyone." He looked at Elena, his dark eyes burning. "And you," he said, "you are going to be my witness. Tonight, the waitress becomes a queen." The penthouses of the St. Regis, New York, were reserved for presidents, royalty, and the 5 men who secretly ran the eastern seaboard. Tonight, the heavy velvet curtains were drawn, shutting out the city lights, creating a claustrophobic chamber of judgment. Lorenzo stood in the foyer of the suite, adjusting his cufflinks. He had traded his rain-soaked tactical gear for a midnight blue tuxedo, tailored to conceal the shoulder holster beneath. He looked every inch the king of New York, cold and untouchable, but his hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the terrifying realization that everything he cared about was balancing on a razor's edge. The door to the dressing room opened, and Marco, standing guard, let out a low whistle. Lorenzo turned, and his breath hitched in his throat. Elena stepped out. The transformation was absolute. Gone was the tired waitress in the grease-stained apron. Gone, too, was the tactical warrior from the nightclub. In her place stood a woman who looked like she could command armies with a whisper. She wore a floor-length gown of liquid red silk, the color of spilled wine, or fresh blood. It was backless, revealing the scars of her past, and slit high up the thigh, concealing a strap where a ceramic knife was undoubtedly hidden. Her dark hair was swept up, exposing the elegant curve of her neck, where a single diamond pendant, a Moretti family heirloom Lorenzo had insisted she wear, rested against her skin. "Do I look the part?" she asked, her voice steady, though her fingers picked nervously at the silk. Lorenzo walked over to her, stopping just inches away. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't just look the part, Elena. You are the part. You are a Vitale, royalty." "I feel like a fraud," she admitted quietly. "I've spent 20 years serving coffee, not negotiating with warlords." "You aren't negotiating," Lorenzo corrected her, his eyes dark with intensity. "You are testifying. You are the voice of the dead. Just look at them the way you looked at me when I told you to get in the car, with that fire. If you do that, they will listen." He offered her his arm. "Ready?" "No," she said, taking it firmly. "Let's go." They entered the main drawing room. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive brandy. 4 men sat around a massive circular table made of ebony. At the head sat Don Salvatore, the Judge Genovese, the oldest and most respected of the bosses, breathing with the aid of an oxygen tank. To his right, Don O'Malley of the Irish syndicates. To his left, Don Cohen of the Jewish banking cartels. And opposite the empty seat reserved for Lorenzo sat Vincente Russo. Vincente looked impeccable in white, relaxed and smiling, swirling a glass of cognac. He didn't look like a man who had just tried to kill them an hour ago. He looked like a man who had already won. "Lorenzo," Don Salvatore wheezed, his voice amplified by a small microphone. "You called this emergency session. You claim a breach of the truce of 1995. This is a grave accusation." Lorenzo pulled out the chair for Elena, settling her into it before taking his own seat. The presence of a woman at the table caused a ripple of murmurs. "I do not claim it, Don Salvatore," Lorenzo said, his voice projecting clearly across the room. "I can prove it." "With what?" Vincente interjected smoothly. "And who is this? I didn't know we were allowing escorts into the commission." Lorenzo didn't rise to the bait. "This is Elena Vitale, daughter of Marco Vitale, the sole survivor of the Great Purge." Silence slammed into the room like a physical weight. Don Salvatore's watery eyes widened. "Impossible. The Vitales are dust." "I am flesh and blood, Don Salvatore," Elena spoke up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a timbre that cut through the smoke. "And I remember you. I remember you gave me a silver dollar on my 5th birthday. You told me to keep it for a rainy day." She reached into her small clutch and placed an old tarnished silver dollar on the ebony table. It spun for a moment before settling with a distinct ring. Don Salvatore stared at the coin. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, seeing the ghosts of her parents in her face. "Marco's girl," he whispered. "She is an imposter," Vincente snapped, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "A grifter Lorenzo hired to discredit me. This is a play for my territory." "The territory you stole?" Lorenzo challenged. He threw the red ledger onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "This is the ledger of Marco Vitale," Lorenzo announced. "It details 10 years of embezzlement. It details the payoffs to the hitmen who burned down the Vitale estate. And it details the bribes paid to the port authorities to transfer control to the Russo family." Don Cohen reached out, his manicured hands opening the book. He was the money man. He understood the numbers better than anyone. He scanned the pages, his expression hardening. "The handwriting matches Marco's archives," Cohen muttered. "And these routing numbers, they lead to accounts in the Caymans, accounts that are currently under the name of VR Holdings." He looked up at Vincente. "Explain this." Vincente stood up, buttoning his jacket. The charm was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian menace. "I don't need to explain anything. I am a capo. I do not answer to a book found in a basement by a waitress." "You answer to the commission!" Don Salvatore banged his fist on the table. "If you orchestrated the purge to seize power, you violated the sacred law. You killed a brother not for honor, but for greed." "Honor?" Vincente scoffed, walking slowly around the table. "Honor is a fairy tale we tell the young soldiers so they march into bullets for us. There is only power, Salvatore. You are old. You are weak. The families need a leader who understands the modern world, not one who clings to the past." Lorenzo stood up, his hand hovering near his lapel. "Is that a confession, Vincente?" "It's a resignation," Vincente said. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than a house, from this outdated club. "You can't leave," Don O'Malley growled, signaling his bodyguards. "You are under review." "Am I?" Vincente smiled. "I think you'll find that I am the one conducting the review." The lights in the St. Regis flickered. A low hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. "What is that?" Elena asked, her instincts screaming. Lorenzo realized it a second too late. "Drones!" Crash! The floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse exploded inward. Not one, but 4 heavy-lift tactical drones smashed through the glass, carrying flashbang payloads. "Get down!" Lorenzo roared, tackling Elena to the carpet. The room erupted in blinding white light and deafening noise. Through the ringing in his ears, Lorenzo heard the sickening sound of automatic gunfire. But it wasn't coming from the drones. The doors to the suite were kicked open. Men in black tactical gear with gas masks poured in. They weren't shooting at Vincente. They were shooting the guards of the other Dons. "It's a coup," Lorenzo realized, shielding Elena's body with his own as glass and debris rained down on them. "He's wiping out the entire commission." Vincente Russo stood calmly in the center of the chaos, putting on a gas mask that he had pulled from his pocket. He looked down at the table where the other dons were scrambling for cover. "The king is dead." Vincente's voice was muffled by the mask. "Long live the emperor." The penthouse of the St. Regis was a chamber of judgment. Lorenzo entered with Elena, who had transformed from a waitress into a queen in a gown of blood-red silk. She wasn't just a date, she was a weapon. They faced the commission, the 5 heads of the families, including the traitor, Vincente Russo. Lorenzo slammed the red ledger onto the ebony table. Vincente stole the territory. He framed the Vitalis. Elena stepped forward, placing an old silver dollar on the table, a gift given to her as a child by the head of the commission, Don Salvatore. "I am Marco's daughter," she declared, her voice steady, "and I am here to testify." The room fell silent. The evidence was damning, but Vincente didn't deny it. Instead, he checked his watch. "The old ways are dead," he sneered. "I don't answer to a book found by a waitress." Suddenly, the windows exploded. Heavy lift drones smashed into the room, detonating flashbangs. Mercenaries in gas masks stormed the suite, gunning down the guards of the other dons. It was a coup. Amidst the smoke and screams, Vincente stood calm, donning a gas mask. "The king is dead," he announced. "Long live the emperor." Lorenzo grabbed Elena, shielding her from the debris. "The kitchen! Move!" They sprinted through the service doors, but they were trapped 20 floors up. The elevators were hacked, and the stairwells were kill boxes. "The laundry chute!" Elena shouted, pointing to the metal hatch. "It leads to the basement." "It's a straight drop," Lorenzo warned. "Better than a bullet." They wrapped themselves in heavy linens to break their fall and jumped. They plummeted through the darkness, tumbling out into the basement laundry room, bruised and gasping for air. They scrambled toward the underground garage, seeking Lorenzo's armored G-Wagon, but standing between them and the car was the Butcher, Vincente's massive executioner, dragging a fire axe along the concrete floor. "Mr. Russo sends his regards," the giant grunted. Lorenzo engaged him, using his tuxedo jacket as a shield, but the man was a tank. A swing of the axe handle cracked Lorenzo's ribs, sending him crashing to the oil-stained floor. The Butcher raised the blade for the killing blow. "Hey!" Elena shouted. The giant turned just as Elena fired a stolen emergency flare gun. The magnesium slug hit him square in the chest, burning at 2,000 degrees. As the Butcher screamed and clawed at his vest, Lorenzo grabbed the fallen axe and ended the fight with a single, brutal swing. They dove into the G-Wagon, tires screeching as they smashed through the garage gate into the rainy night. "Vincente thinks he won," Lorenzo gasped, clutching his side. "He thinks he cut off the head of the snake." "Where can we go?" Elena asked, gripping his hand. "The police are everywhere." "We go to the mountains," Lorenzo said, his eyes cold. "He forgot about my mother. She knows where the bodies are buried. We're going to the sanctuary." The sanctuary was a crumbling monastery deep in the Catskills, silent and forgotten. Lorenzo and Elena arrived as dawn broke, battered and bleeding, the G-Wagon running on fumes. Inside, they found Donatella waiting, her mind surprisingly sharp, seated like a queen on an old pew. "Vincente Russo is coming with an army, Mama," Lorenzo warned, collapsing as Elena tended to his broken ribs. "We have no soldiers left." Donatella stood and walked to a statue of the Virgin Mary. "Vincente thinks power is bullets. He forgets power is secrets." She pressed a hidden brick, revealing a dusty compartment containing an ancient reel-to-reel tape recorder. 20 years ago, Donatella explained, "Vincente came to our house, drunk on victory. He boasted to my husband about framing Marco Vitale. I recorded it." Lorenzo stared at the tape. It was the Omerta nuclear option, proof that Vincente had violated the sacred blood oath by framing a brother for greed. "If we play this for his men, he's finished. But how?" "The bell tower," Elena said, looking at the PA system wiring. "I can rig it to broadcast across the valley, but I need time." Outside, the silence broke. Vincente Russo had arrived with 50 mercenaries and heavy weaponry. His voice boomed through a megaphone. "Lorenzo! Send out the girl or we burn this holy place to the ground. You have 3 minutes." While Lorenzo barricaded the doors, Elena worked furiously in the loft, splicing copper wires with trembling fingers. 2 minutes, Vincente screamed. Now, Lorenzo yelled. Elena hit the switch. Static crackled through the massive speakers, followed by a voice that stopped every older mobster in their tracks, the late Don Antonio. Then, Vincente's own voice, younger and arrogant, thundered across the mountains. Marco was weak. I falsified the ledgers. I hired the hitmen. I will be king. Vincente froze. His capos lowered their guns, horror dawning on their faces. To kill for business was one thing. To betray the family for greed was a mortal sin. It's a fake! Vincente shrieked, grabbing a flamethrower from a soldier. Kill them! No, said Paulie, his underboss. Paulie stepped forward, tears in his eyes. I remember that night, Vincente. You stand down. When Vincente turned the weapon on his own men, Paulie didn't hesitate. A single shot rang out. Vincente Russo fell backward into the mud, dead before he hit the ground. One by one, the soldiers dropped to their knees, bowing not to the corpse, but to Lorenzo, who emerged from the church doors. The war was over. 6 months later, Sal's trattoria had reopened, its windows now bulletproof, the sign painted in gold. Inside, the combined Moretti and Vitale families gathered for a feast. The fear was gone. Lorenzo stood at the bar, watching Elena emerge from the kitchen. She wore a simple white dress, carrying a platter of osso buco. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was the glue holding the empire together. He pulled her close, kissing her deeply in front of everyone. The boss is retired, he whispered against her lips. I'm just a man in love. Elena smiled, leaning close to whisper in the dialect that had started it all. I stole your heart, but you saved my soul. Lorenzo laughed, realizing he was the most powerful man in New York, not because of the gun at his hip, but because the woman beside him had chosen to stay. And that is how a simple phrase in a forgotten dialect brought down an empire and united two hearts. From the streets of Brooklyn to the mountains, Elena and Lorenzo proved that loyalty is thicker than water. If you enjoyed this roller coaster of mafia romance and justice, please smash that like button. It helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. What did you think of the ending? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.